He was cold and ruthless, until her red dress melted his heart. Hey, beautiful souls, thank you so much for joining us today. You're about to dive into a story of love, heartbreak, and hope, a powerful tale of a ruthless millionaire whose icy heart melts when he sees his secretary in a red dress. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Will love conquer all, or will betrayal shatter everything? Stay tuned to find out. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing where my wonderful viewers come from around the world. Get comfy. Hit that like button if you love emotional stories. And let's get started with today's journey. Julian Carter, at just 32, had achieved what most men only dared to dream of. An empire built on precision, ruthlessness, and an unrelenting hunger for dominance. Towering over the city in his sleek, glass-walled skyscraper, his office was a mirror of his soul, cold, sharp-edged and devoid of softness. The world called him brilliant, but behind closed boardroom doors, his brilliance came at the cost of basic decency. His blue eyes, icy and analytical, scanned people like numbers on a spreadsheet, never seeing hearts, only functions. To his employees, he wasn't a boss. He was a monarch ruling with an iron glare and a voice that cut deeper than silence. Men stepped lightly in his presence, their confidence shriveling under the weight of his dismissiveness. Women, though occasionally drawn to his Hollywood looks, quickly learned his beauty was merely the mask of an unyielding storm. There was no warmth in his compliments, only calculated observations. No encouragement in his tone, only sharp directives. Julian didn't believe in kindness. He believed in control. Emotions were liabilities. Compassion was a disease. He wasn't just rich, he was emotionally untouchable. Or so he thought. That belief was shattered the moment Layla walked into his domain. She wasn't just another applicant. She was a vision that disturbed his carefully arranged world. With skin the color of sun-kissed, bronze and a presence that radiated unspoken strength. Layla didn't demand attention, she drew it effortlessly. Her hair flowed in soft waves, her movements precise yet elegant, and her eyes held a story of survival that even his heartless intuition could detect but chose to ignore. She didn't shrink under his gaze. She didn't stutter when he barked instructions. She held her spine straight, her voice steady, and her professionalism sharper than any suit in the building. He told himself she was just another assistant, temporary, replaceable. But her quiet confidence irritated him in a way he couldn't explain. She wasn't charmed by his status. She wasn't impressed by his cars or the way others jumped at his command. She didn't seek his approval, and that, more than anything, unnerved him. On her first day, when he deliberately dropped her coffee request mid-sentence to test her patience, she simply placed the cup before him without a word and walked away, leaving behind a scent of jasmine and defiance. Every small act of dignity she displayed was a rebellion against his toxic rule, and though he didn't show it, he noticed. Julian often watched her from the corner of his eye as she typed flawlessly, answered calls with grace, and dealt with office tension like a seasoned diplomat. Where others crumbled under his criticism, she absorbed it like stone absorbs rain, silently, patiently. Sometimes he crafted cruel remarks just to see if she would flinch. She never did. That calmness was unnerving. That silence, piercing. He tried to shake her to prove that even she had a breaking point. Because if she didn't, it meant she was stronger than him in a way that frightened him. Still, every day she showed up 10 minutes early, dressed immaculately in modest outfits that somehow only amplified her natural beauty. Her posture never bent, her tone never wavered, and when she smiled at others in the office, never at him, it stirred something foreign inside his chest. He often caught himself watching her reflection in the glass, hating how his thoughts drifted. One night, as he sat alone reviewing financial reports, he saw her packing her bag in the distance. She didn't notice him staring, but in that brief moment, he saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes, a tired sort of strength that spoke of wounds she never voiced. It haunted him, not enough to change, but enough to make him restless. The next morning, he walked in earlier than usual, only to find she had already arrived. and was tidying up the meeting room without being asked. "You think staying late and coming early will earn you points?" He sneered. She didn't look up. "I don't work for points, Mr. Carter. I work with pride." It hit him harder than he let show. He scoffed and walked away, but her words stayed. That pride, that quiet fire, made her more than just a secretary. She was a mirror, and he hated what he saw in his own reflection. He began resenting her, not for doing anything wrong, but for simply existing with more humanity than he could ever admit to needing. The staff noticed his fixation. They whispered about it, but Layla never entertained gossip. She didn't engage. She stayed the same, steady, respectful, unreachable. He tried to convince himself she was nothing, just another background character in the drama of his success. But when she entered his office, the air always seemed to change. He told himself it was irritation. He lied. Every file she handed him, every pen she replaced, every quiet glance, she gave toward the window instead of him. Each was a pebble in the landslide that would one day bury his pride. But not yet. For now, Julian Carter, the ice-hearted king, still ruled, too proud to admit he was slipping, too blind to see that the real power in the room was not his wealth, but the woman quietly rewriting his story with every dignified breath she took. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the peaceful sense. Rather, they were heavy with something unnamed, something brewing just beneath the surface of the ordinary. Layla moved through the office like a soft breeze in a storm shelter, her presence unfazed by the constant thunder that was Julian Carter's voice. He remained sharp-tongued and impatient, slamming doors when deals went south, tossing files across the table when numbers didn't match projections. And yet there she was, always steady, always composed, like the calm center of a hurricane he didn't know how to reach. He insulted her work with precision, trying to provoke a crack in that poised armor. But she only responded with clearer formatting, more refined presentations, and even calmer replies. It infuriated him, not because she was failing, but because she wasn't. Her ability to remain unmoved by his behavior, her unwavering professionalism, her refusal to flinch or flatter, it all peeled something open in him he wasn't ready to face. In meetings, when she stood quietly in the corner taking notes, he found his eyes drifting toward her, not in lust, not yet, but in a strange pull he didn't recognize. There was a softness in the curve of her jaw when she concentrated, a focus in her eyes that was humbling. He once overheard her correcting a junior staff member in the break room, not with authority, but with kindness. And he hated that it stayed in his head for hours. It wasn't her beauty alone that disturbed his focus. It was the silence she carried like a weapon. She didn't play office games. She didn't gossip in the elevators or giggle at the partners, jokes during cocktail events. She worked gracefully and relentlessly and left without a trace. And the more she said nothing, the more he found himself inventing reasons to hear her speak. "Why are these reports late?" he asked one afternoon, though he knew they were on time. Without blinking, she met his eyes. "They're on your desk already, sir." Her voice was quiet but unwavering. He stared at her for a moment too long. She didn't flinch. He looked away first. In board meetings, he began noticing she anticipated his needs without ever being told. A pen would be in place just when his ran out of ink, notes organized before he realized he needed them. Her intuition was surgical, and it unsettled him. One morning, he stepped out of his office and saw her assisting an elderly janitor, whose hand trembled while holding a mop. She knelt beside him, tying his loose shoelace with a tenderness that didn't belong in the walls of power. Julian said nothing, but the image refused to leave him. He told himself she was a distraction, but deep down he knew she was a reminder of something human, something he had long buried under layers of gold cufflinks and quarterly profits. He began to notice how others smiled when she passed by, how she remembered birthdays, how she stayed after hours to help interns find their footing. He found himself listening to her laugh from behind the glass walls, a sound he never heard directed at him. It stung more than he cared to admit. One evening, during a storm, the power flickered in the building. Most had gone home early, but she stayed behind to finish a presentation he needed. As thunder rolled in the background, he stood by the doorway, watching her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of her laptop. "You should leave," he said gruffly. She didn't look up. "It's not done yet." Her calmness in the face of chaos unnerved him. He left without another word, but stood outside the building for 30 minutes, waiting until he saw her exit safely. He told himself it was protocol. It wasn't. Over time, his cruelty began to dull around her, not because he wanted it to, but because it no longer made sense. Every sharp word thrown her way came back to him like a dull boomerang, pointless and tired. One morning, he accidentally called her by her first name in front of the team. "Layla, get me the—" He caught himself mid-sentence. She looked up, surprised. It was the first time he had ever said her name without venom. Something in the room shifted. No one said a word. That night, he stared at his reflection in the mirror of his penthouse suite and saw something new in his own eyes. Hesitation, vulnerability. He had never felt weaker. He had never felt more human. And that realization birthed not from grand gestures, but from the quiet rebellion of a brown-skinned woman who refused to let the world change her core. That realization terrified him more than losing everything he had ever built. He couldn't explain the way she disrupted his rhythm. She didn't confront him, didn't challenge him openly. But somehow, without lifting a finger, she had made his empire feel unstable, not in profit margins, but in meaning. And that was a threat he had no strategy to fight. He spent nights asking himself why. Why her? Why now? Why this gnawing feeling in his chest when she walked past him with her notebook held tightly against her chest and headphones in her ears, humming a song he didn't recognize? He didn't have answers. All he had was the growing suspicion that he was changing, and that change wore red lipstick, moved with grace, and had a silence louder than any scream he had ever heard. The night sky stretched above Julian Carter's estate like a velvet curtain embroidered with stars, but even its celestial shimmer couldn't rival the glow emanating from the chandeliers that hung like crystal crowns above the marbled ballroom. It was his birthday, an event he usually ignored, considering celebrations beneath him, but this year felt different. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the growing itch of change crawling under his skin. Whatever it was, for the first time in years, he'd opened the gates of his secluded world to his staff, dressing the estate in decadence, the kind that whispered wealth in every corner. Gold-trimmed walls, lit violinists, champagne towers reflecting light like shattered rainbows. The air buzzed with chatter, laughter, the clink of glass, and yet Julian stood still, untouched by the festivity, sipping from a crystal glass but tasting nothing. And then time fractured. The sound dimmed. The air thickened. Because she walked in, Layla, not the secretary, who filed reports and returned calls, but a vision in red satin that poured over her like liquid fire. The gown hugged her like it had been tailored by destiny, off-shoulder, elegant, a slit that whispered power, not invitation. Her brown skin shimmered under the ambient lights, not because of makeup or glitter, but because she radiated something more potent, self-respect, quiet rebellion, and undeniable grace. Her hair flowed in soft waves down her back, framing her neckline like poetry. Her eyes, deepened with kohl, held stories untold, fierce, feminine, unbending. Her lips stained the shade of crushed roses, curved into the faintest smile as she nodded politely to colleagues, completely unaware of the storm she had ignited. Julian froze mid-step, unable to blink, to breathe, to think. The room spun behind her, blurred and irrelevant. All his practiced arrogance, his crafted poise, his fortress of emotional distance crumbled in the span of 3 heartbeats. He saw her not as an employee, not as a challenge, but as a woman so magnetic she defied everything. He thought he knew about control. His grip on the glass tightened until the cold nearly cracked through, but he couldn't move. For a moment he wasn't the king of the empire. He was a man, undone, exposed, wrecked by a single glance. She didn't even see him yet. That made it worse, or better. He watched her glide across the floor, her every step fluid, unhurried, unbothered. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. That's what shattered him. She simply was. and that was enough to bring the god of marble walls to his knees internally. Conversations swirled around him. Praise for the event, comments about the food, birthday wishes that felt distant. But his world had reduced to the sound of her, heels against the marble floor. When she finally turned and their eyes met across the room, a pulse thundered in his chest, betraying him. She looked at him, not with admiration, not with awe, but with the same calm expression she wore every Monday morning. And it humbled him more than any rejection could have. There was no seduction in her gaze, no invitation, yet he found himself drawn forward, like a man lost in the desert crawling toward water. As she stood near the grand staircase, speaking to a junior designer with gentle encouragement, Julian found himself walking toward her without meaning to. His legs acted on impulse, his heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm. "You came," he said, voice lower than intended. She turned, tilting her head slightly. "You invited the entire office. It would have been rude not to." That tone, balanced, poised, untouched by his wealth or presence, hit harder than any flirtation. "You look—" he began, then stopped because how could he describe it? Stunning felt too shallow, beautiful too common, divine perhaps, but even that felt inadequate. She raised an eyebrow. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head, blinking like a man trying to wake up. "No, everything's perfect." She nodded, offering a small, polite smile, then turned slightly to resume her conversation, as if his compliment was no different than a post-it note on her desk. And that again broke something inside him. For the next hour, he watched her float through the room like a secret melody. Never loud, never overreaching, just unforgettable. Guests came and went. Speeches were made. But when it came time for the cake cutting, he scanned the crowd and only searched for her. When he found her at the edge of the room, standing near the garden doors, bathed in moonlight, he motioned her forward, not by command, but with a silent plea. She hesitated, then stepped closer. When the candles flickered and everyone clapped, he didn't reach for the knife alone. He reached for her hand. Her eyes widened slightly, unsure, but he held it, not possessively, but as if grounding himself. And in front of 100 blinking eyes, Julian Carter, the man known for his ice and ego, turned to the crowd and said without tremor, "This year I want more than wishes. I want honesty. I want to say something real." He looked at her, voice quiet yet clear. "I'm in love with her." Gasps echoed. Silence fell. But in that suspended moment he saw her, not shocked, but unreadable, as if even now her heart was deciding whether to believe him. And for the first time in his life, Julian wasn't sure if he deserved to be believed. The room had frozen in time, not because of the candles or the glittering cake, but because Julian Carter, the man known for dismissing emotion like a spreadsheet, error, had just confessed love in front of everyone who once feared his name. Layla stood beside him, her hand still in his, but her breath caught in her chest, her mind spinning in 1,000 directions. The gasps around them were muffled echoes against the thudding of her heart. She blinked, unsure if this was some cruel jest, but one look into Julian's eyes, soft, unguarded, trembling at the edges, told her the truth. This was not performance. This was surrender. She didn't speak, not then, but she didn't pull her hand away either. That was answer enough. The next morning the office buzzed, not with the usual tension, but with cautious curiosity. Julian arrived not in silence and shadow, but with a slight smile and Layla by his side. Whispers flew like butterflies through cubicles, but no one dared question the way he opened her car door, or how he looked at her like she was the sunrise after 1,000 grey winters. He didn't issue orders that morning. He offered good mornings. He thanked people. He noticed things, small things, like someone's new haircut or a barista's. Exhausted eyes, and for the first time, the Julian Carter who had once built walls from ego began planting seeds of humanity. His time with Layla deepened quietly, not in public declarations but in private shifts. There were rooftop dinners where the stars leaned closer just to listen. Moments where they shared old wounds and whispered. New dreams over candlelight and soft jazz. Layla would laugh, and Julian would watch her like it was the first time, every time. They drove out of the city on weekends, windows down, laughter tangled in the wind, his hand resting on her knee like a silent promise. In the spaces where silence once reigned, there was now ease, warmth, and gentle exploration. He took her to art galleries, not because he loved paintings, but because she did. And she'd explain each canvas with that soft light in her eyes. And he'd fall in love again in oil strokes, in the way she moved her hands while speaking. Their wedding came sooner than the world expected. It wasn't in a cathedral or castle, but in a garden that smelled of lavender and rain, where she walked barefoot through petals, and he waited with shaking hands and a heart no longer frozen. There were no grand speeches, only the look they shared as they vowed without words to protect whatever it was they'd found. On their honeymoon, time slowed to a rhythm made only for two. In a quiet cottage by the sea, he learned her every freckle and listened to the stories her body told with every breath and sigh. He kissed her like prayers he'd never known he needed to say. Nights melted into mornings with tangled sheets, and mornings into afternoons with whispered laughter and sunlight on skin. He touched her not just with desire but reverence, tracing the line of her spine like poetry, holding her face like she was both question and answer. And in between the passion were quiet hours, her head on his chest, his fingers in her curls, two souls remembering how to be whole. He spoke to her with a new voice, one softened by awe, no longer afraid of tenderness. "I used to think love made men weak," he said once under a moonlit sky. "But I feel stronger with you than I ever did alone." She smiled, fingers brushing his lips. "That's because this isn't weakness. It's truth." For a while they were everything, laughter in rainstorms, kisses in morning light, peace after war. Layla saw a version of Julian no one else had ever seen, the man beneath the armor, the boy who once believed love didn't exist. And Julian? He saw God every time she smiled, every time she said his name, like a melody only she could sing. They were no longer boss and secretary, no longer cold steel and silent grace. They were lovers, partners, home. And for a while, in that suspended bubble of intimacy and trust, it truly felt like nothing could shatter what they had built together. For a while, love had wrapped them in its gentle warmth. And Layla had truly believed this version of Julian, the man who kissed her eyelids before dawn and whispered dreams into her hair, was real and lasting. But then everything changed. It began with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The day she held his hands between hers and told him she was pregnant. She had expected joy, maybe even tears of happiness, but instead, his fingers stiffened in hers. His expression froze like frost returning to glass. The silence that followed was colder than any words. "I see," he'd said, voice barely a whisper, before pulling away under the excuse of a meeting that suddenly couldn't wait. From that day on, distance crept into their home like a shadow that never left. Julian began staying late at work again, not the kind of late born from ambition, but the kind that made excuses. He stopped asking about her cravings, her doctor visits, the tiny flutters in her belly that she longed to share with someone. At dinner, she would talk softly, trying to reach him, but he would only nod absent-mindedly, his eyes scrolling through his phone, his smile ghosted. One night the hours ticked by and he never returned. She waited at the window until morning bled through the curtains and her heart gave up pretending. The next afternoon, with trembling fingers and a chest tightening around her lungs, she followed the uneasy truth her instincts had been whispering. And there it was, undeniable, photos, a receipt from an expensive restaurant she'd never been to, a woman's name on a hotel reservation. Her world cracked quietly without screaming. No dramatic tears, just silence, a silence that filled her bones and told her she and her unborn child were no longer welcome in the life they had once built. That night, Layla stood in their once warm bedroom, now turned cold with betrayal, and looked around one last time. She saw the memories, his jacket on the chair, her favorite books by the bedside, the framed wedding photo where his smile seemed so real. But those were echoes now, illusions, and she was done being a woman, trapped in someone else's lie. She didn't confront him. She didn't cry at his feet or scream why. She packed her essentials slowly. Documents, a few clothes, the sonogram photo tucked safely in her purse. She left behind the diamond ring on the dresser and the house key on the counter. She refused his money. She didn't need it. She had something stronger, dignity and the heartbeat of a new life inside her. That child, growing quietly under her ribs, was her reason now, her strength, her compass. When Julian returned late that night to find the house dark and empty, he barely noticed at first. It wasn't until he saw the open closet, the missing photo frame, and the faint scent of her perfume fading from the room, that he realized what he had lost. He called. She didn't answer. He emailed. She never replied. And somewhere deep inside, even he knew he didn't deserve a response. Not after discarding the woman who had once lit his soul like fire. Not after turning his back on the life they had begun to create. While he slipped back into old patterns, attending parties and drowning guilt in distraction, Layla quietly built a new life, one free from lies. She would carry this child alone, not as a burden, but as a blessing. Because even when love shattered, she still had something unbreakable, her strength, her truth, and the silent promise that she would never let her child grow up believing love meant pain. 3 years had passed, but time had done nothing to dull the ache. Julian Carter, once the man who believed he owned the world, now sat atop an empire that felt hollow. He had it all, luxury cars, penthouse views, roaring applause in boardrooms, but none of it could silence the echo of a name. He no longer dared to speak aloud. Layla haunted his every night. Her laughter, her scent, her touch, they lived in the cracks of his silence, in the spaces where her absence had built a home. Guilt became his most loyal companion, regret his shadow. Then came a rainy evening, the kind where the world seems to weep for you. Julian was driving through a quieter part of town, aimless, searching for something, though he didn't know what. That's when he saw him, a tiny figure standing at the edge of the sidewalk, soaked in rain, his small hands rubbing a cloth against the windshield of a stranger's car. A boy, maybe 3 years old. His clothes were too thin for the weather, his sneakers damp and worn. Julian slowed down, more out of instinct than recognition, but as the child turned to glance at the approaching headlights, everything inside Julian shattered. Those eyes, icy blue, mirror reflections of his own, stared back at him. He slammed the brakes and got out, breath caught in his throat, knees weak. Rain soaked his designer coat, but he didn't care. The boy looked up again, startled. Then, as if sensing something deeper than memory, he turned and ran, not in fear, but straight into the arms of a woman standing across the street. She bent to catch him, wrapping him in her embrace, pressing his soaked little body to her chest. And there she was, Layla, hair damp, eyes shining with emotion that screamed louder than any words. She hadn't changed much, still radiant, still graceful, but now her beauty held an ache, a depth carved by heartbreak and survival. Julian stood in the middle of the street, heart thudding like thunder, eyes locked on the family that should have been his. The boy clutched her leg, burying his face in the folds of her coat. And Julian, the ruthless king who once ruled hearts like currency, dropped to his knees on the wet pavement. He didn't care about the cars honking or the water soaking through his trousers. Layla, he choked, voice breaking as his tears mixed with the rain. I was blind. I was so blind. I left behind everything that truly mattered. I let my pride destroy the only thing that ever made me whole. She didn't speak. Her eyes remained fixed on him, full of pain, full of memory. But not hate. Never hate. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Julian continued, trembling. But I'm begging you. Not as the man I used to be. As the man I became without you, empty, lost, broken. Please, just give me one more chance to make this right. The boy looked at his mother, then at the stranger kneeling before them. He didn't understand the words, but something in him, perhaps blood, perhaps soul, reached out. Layla swallowed hard, her hand resting on her son's head. And for a long, quiet moment, the rain was the only sound. Then gently she stepped forward, not with certainty but with courage. And that first step said everything her voice hadn't yet dared to say. Layla stood silently in the rain-soaked street, the weight of years pressing down on her like the cold droplets that clung to her skin. Each heartbeat carried the echoes of pain, betrayal, and nights spent wondering if love was ever meant to last. But as she looked at Julian, really looked, beyond the towering figure of the ruthless man she once knew, she saw something different in his eyes. Not arrogance, not cruelty, but raw, trembling regret. A love stripped bare, vulnerable and honest in a way she hadn't dared to imagine. Time and wounds had softened him, revealed a man broken by his own mistakes and desperate for redemption. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward and took his trembling hand, guiding it gently toward the small chest of their son nestled between them, who looked up with innocent eyes full of unspoken hope. "You left once," she whispered, her voice steady but fierce. "Don't ever leave again." The words hung in the air like a sacred vow, a bridge between past and future, warning and promise intertwined. Julian's defenses crumbled like fragile glass. Tears streamed down his face as he fell into her arms, the weight of his sorrow spilling forth in sobs that shook his very soul. In that embrace, years of silence and pain melted away, replaced by the fragile beginnings of healing. From that moment forward, Julian was no longer the cold, ruthless man who ruled by fear and wealth. He became the husband and father they deserved, the man who put love before ambition, tenderness before power. He learned to listen, to cherish, and to build a home where laughter outshone the ghosts of past mistakes. Their second wedding was quiet, far from the grandeur of his first. But every vow spoken was a seed of truth planted in the fertile soil of forgiveness. Surrounded by the few who truly mattered, they exchanged promises not of perfection, but of presence, of showing up even when it was hard, of choosing each other every day. Their son giggled between them, the embodiment of a love that had weathered storms and come through stronger. Together, they faced the future with open hearts, weaving a life rich with warmth, honesty, and devotion. No longer shadows of their former selves, but partners in a story rewritten by grace and hope. And in the quiet moments, the bedtime stories, the stolen kisses in sunlit kitchens, the hands held tightly on rough days, they knew one truth above all. This time, their love was forever.